This podcast was created as a part of Podcast Lab by India Film Project in association with Anchor by Spotify.
What does creativity mean to me? Creativity, if anything, is a gift. It's an inheritance we get, if we are lucky, from those who love us the most. Think about it. The very first exposure we have to creative expression, for most of us, is a lullaby our mother might sing to us to soothe us when we're crying, or a bedtime story our father would tell us to calm us if we're too excited for bedtime. That's where we get our language, and that's where we first learn the ability to create something anew when it's needed. When I look for creative inspiration, I don't really find it in Oscar winning directors or Booker Prize winners. I find it in my grandfather, who can make any baby laugh within a few minutes of meeting them. A superpower that works on humans, yes, but I found out only yesterday that it works on dogs as well, which is impressive. Or maybe I find it in a 19-year-old with a tiny stall in Jaipur who keeps a folder of his grandfather's achievements in his phone and apprentices with his father to keep the family craft alive. Or maybe in the community of Kinnerts who somehow discovered my cousin was getting married in a couple days and gave their business card to my uncle. High art is valuable. I'm not taking anything away from that. And it's beautiful. But it's also a privilege of the rich. I find true creativity resides in communities who bear the brunt of society's evils. Because at the end of the day, creativity is the imaginative power to envision a reality that does not yet exist, but could, and the moral fortitude to bring that vision to fruition.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Closet Writer Chronicles. I'm your host Sangeeta, aka the Moody Marshmallow. You just heard our guest for today, Saoirse. Saoirse's name and passion are the same: freedom. As an exophonic writer, their academic interests revolve around linguistic power dynamics, especially in connection to the land. They are also a freelance editor and are currently associated with Oyster River Pages and the Winnow magazine. On this episode, we talk about writing, writer's block, social media poetry, translations, and colonialism and the English language. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Closet Writer Chronicles. This week I have with me Saoirse. Welcome to the show, Saoirse. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you, Sangeeta. It's wonderful to be here.
So, first of all, I'm just excited to have you here because I know you are like this treasure chest of knowledge, first of all, which is why I'm so excited to have you on this show. I just hope I'm able to ask you like smart enough questions and make the most of this interview for our listeners. But yeah, I think the first question I want to ask you before getting into the interview part of it is, and I'm sure you get this a lot, is what does Saoirse mean? Because the first time I virtually met you and I saw your name, I thought of Saoirse Ronan because that's the only other Saoirse I know. But yeah, tell us the story behind your name and what it means.
For sure. And that's one of those questions that always means a lot to me because it means people care. So thank you for asking it. So the connection you made to Saoirse Ronan is actually pretty appropriate because she's Irish and it's an Irish name.
Mm-hmm.
So that connection is always there.
Mm.
The meaning behind Saoirse is freedom. And the way I got the name, I was actually not born with this name. My parents did not name me Saoirse. And I kind of hated the name my parents gave me. So around the age of 7 or something, I decided that I wanted to change my name. And I had no clue what my name should be. So I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about what I wanted my name to be, and more importantly than that, why.
Hmm.
And you know this, and a lot of people who know me know this, that I'm a huge Doctor Who fan,
Oh, right.
the British show.
Yeah.
And in Doctor Who, there's this one passing comment. It just said very briefly by the 11th Doctors that the name that you choose for yourself is like a promise you make.
Okay.
It's who you stand for.
Uh-huh.
So I decided that that was going to be my philosophy in terms of choosing a name. I wanted a name that stood for my philosophy in life.
Mm-hmm.
And that, so that every time somebody calls me by that name, I'm reminded of that philosophy, and I'm reminded of what I want to do in life, what I want to fight for.
Okay.
And this is at the age of 12, around the age of 12 that I saw this episode of Doctor
Wow.
Who. So like 12-year-olds have no idea what their philosophy in life is. I didn't either.
Mm-hmm.
But it gave me some direction on where to look for,
Mm-hmm.
where to look for a name. And I kept looking and I never found anything. I didn't really give up, but it stopped being a priority after a
Okay.
year or so. And then I read a book.
Okay.
I didn't particularly like the book. I didn't
Okay.
particularly like this character that was named Saoirse, but Saoirse as a word just kind of appealed to me. The sound appealed to me. And then I looked up the meaning, and the meaning was everything that I wanted it to be. This was also around the time that we had the Nirbhaya case.
Mm.
So that was huge on my mind.
Okay.
The LGBTQ movement was huge on my mind. So freedom was something was that had a lot of meaning for me. And that's when I kind of started to adopt this name for myself. First changing it on my social media, then asking my friends to call it, up until now, where most people don't know my birth name.
Okay.
They know me as Saoirse.
Okay. Wow, that's really fascinating to know that, because even I didn't realize that you had a name before Saoirse. So that's that's really interesting to know that there's been a journey of that. And it's really cool that as a 12-year-old you were thinking about these things. As a 12-year-old, I was very clueless. So it's really cool to see how aware you were, and I guess how much of depth you had at that age, which I think is
Honestly,
amazing.
I was clueless too. um I just kind of hated her name, and I was driven by that hate for the most
Okay.
part, and I saw too much TV for my health. That's what was going on, as any 12-year-old should. I think we should all watch too much TV at the age of 12.
That is true. I was pretty much a television kid myself. So I resonate with that for sure. But
Yeah.
yeah, if you were, this TV kid, how did you get into writing, How did that happen? And, when did you realize that this is something you really enjoy doing and could possibly do professionally?
Honestly, writing came late for me, but storytelling didn't.
Okay.
um so I was really into stories as a child, and maybe that's why I gravitated towards the TV and towards books from a very young age. But my earliest memories of storytelling was my father telling me, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata before going to sleep. It
Mm.
was something that I needed before
Mm-hmm.
I went to sleep. Like, that was just important for me. Not the stories themselves. Like, I'm not religious. I don't really care
Mm-hmm.
about the Ramayana as like a religious text,
Yeah.
but the act of sitting with my father and hearing stories was important to me, to
Right.
the extent that, if my father was working late on a given night and he came back home at 3 a.m., I
Mm.
would wait up till 3 a.m., have dinner with my parents, and then he would tell me the story before I would go to sleep at like 3:30 or 4 in the morning,
Okay.
ready for school at 7.
Hmm.
So the storytelling was an important part of my growing up experience. And
Hmm.
I started writing stories, well, telling stories, not writing them down, but telling
Okay.
stories at a very young age. And
Okay.
I was always into kind of the oral culture of poetry, the kind that you see in Urdu shairi and
Yeah.
Hindi poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I started entering into this.
Okay.
And it was around like fifth or sixth standard that I really started sitting down to read books.
Okay.
And from there, I was just like, I want to be a writer. That's what I want to be when I grow up. Not something Desi parents want to hear from their kids
Yeah.
at the age of 11 or 12, and they probably thought that it was a phase.
Hmm.
If it was, it's still ongoing and it has no intentions of stopping.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, it's really not the most conventional career choice, especially when you come from an Indian family or I guess most South Asian families. I don't think like because usually they'd want a career with stability. And when you say anything that's creatively related, that's not really considered stable. So, how did you manage to convince them, or are you still convincing them?
I think they're convinced at this point just
Oh, that's
because
great.
of the mostly because they're stuck in it. It's the sunk cost fallacy is when you put in money into a lost cause, you keep putting in money in the hopes of getting it, even though you know it's a lost cause.
Oh my God.
That's called the sunk cost fallacy. That's kind of what's going on with my parents. Um, I was, like I said, I was in about fifth or sixth standard that I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And
Yeah.
I grew up in a typical Desi middle class family. So, like, my father wanted me to be a doctor. My
Hmm.
mother wanted me to be a mathematician.
Okay.
Neither of them saw an issue with the other person's ambitions for me. Forget asking me. They were like,
Oh,
these
wow.
two are not mutually compatible, but they didn't care about that part of it. Right.
Okay.
And I'm sure lots of Desi kids can kind of relate to that experience of growing up with Desi parents.
Hmm.
I was good at math. So that was something that my mother just kind of decided that she's good at math, she's going to be fine.
Okay. Wow.
And I don't know. At the time when I decided, there was a lot of fights, there was a lot of, arguing back and forth. And at
Hmm.
some point, my mother, probably just to shut me up, said, if you can prove to me that you can make a living as a writer, I'll let you do it.
Okay. Wow. And did you do it?
Uh, well, I started to. I won a competition. The first thing I did was, and this was just to like smooch my mother up, I won a card writing competition that was organized by Archie's.
Oh, okay.
They wanted you to write like Mother's Day cards.
Okay.
So I wrote a Mother's Day card and I won that competition. And that was like the first thing that I showed my mother. Like, she is the one who had given me this offer of proving myself.
Okay.
So I did that. And that was the first thing I did. And then I started a blog that was centered on reading and that was centered on like recommending books to people. Like, that was the core of the blog, is I
Hmm.
would recommend books. And
Hmm.
every book blog does that, every book reviewer does that, but
Mm-hmm.
I was giving personalized recommendations to each individual reader.
Wow. Okay.
And that's intense work, but
Yeah.
I was also reading like 100 books a year, so it was easy for me to find something that somebody would like. And I really honed those skills of finding what people like,
Uh-huh.
and finding books that fit those criteria.
Oh, wow. It almost sounds like bibliotherapy, actually.
I'm not familiar with bibliotherapy, but I'm gonna
Oh,
check them out
oh
now.
no. So a bibliotherapist is someone who, if I
Oh,
remember the term correctly, it's basically someone who recommends books to you to read based on what you're feeling. Is a very broad. I don't think I'm explaining it correctly, but yes, please look it up. I will share it on my
yeah.
social media as well. But
Oh, yeah.
yeah, that's essentially it's therapy through books, basically for mental health.
Yeah, I've heard of music therapy, but bibliotherapy is new to me. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm not sure that was what I was doing, in the sense that I wasn't helping anybody with
Yeah,
their
yeah.
mental health
Of course, yeah.
in any shape or form. It was more just, if you tell me the last three books you liked, I could probably figure out that you liked strong female characters who had mother issues, and I could find books with strong female characters who had mother issues that you would like.
Mm.
Uh, um, but that was kind of the focus of that, and the blog helped me get a scholarship to go to college in the States for
Wow.
my bachelor's and that's when I said that I'm going to do my bachelor's in English and sociology. I've got this scholarship that covers a big chunk of my tuition to go to the States. And that was kind of what proved it to my parents. And at this
Mm.
point, we have put in so much money because, US education system is very expensive.
Yeah.
We've put in so much money that it's entered into the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, fair enough. No, but that's amazing that, you really went after what you wanted and, and you achieved also, in terms of getting that education you wanted to help build what it is that you really want to do with your life, which is amazing and is honestly is quite inspirational, Saoirse. I don't know if you realize it, but it really is. And, after that, like, I'm assuming by this point you had made the decision then, right? To like do this fully professionally, be like an editor and writer? Or were you looking, or were you keeping your options open in terms of, I want to be in literature, but I'm still not sure what exactly I want to do with literature?
I knew that I wanted to be a writer. And with the blog, I kind of realized that writing was not what I wanted to be my primary, like, money making profession.
Okay.
Because good writing doesn't make money and bad writing does make money. That's part of
Okay.
how. No, I'm being serious. Like, if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
look at the Booker Prize winning novels, or all of these like really good novels, the ones that win prizes, they're not the ones that are selling in huge amounts.
Mm,
And the ones who are selling, the Chetan Bhagat is never going to win
yeah,
the
fair
Booker
enough.
Prize. Is so if you want to make money writing,
Mm,
then you have to write for the masses,
right,
and there's nothing wrong with that.
right,
But that's not taking writing as the pure art form that it is. You're
right.
doing commercial writing. Again,
Fair enough.
nothing wrong with commercial writing, but
Mm,
I kind of saw this scene and realized I decided that I did not want to do commercial writing. So I knew that writing was never going to be my primary profession.
okay.
I'm going to treat it professionally, but it's never going to be my primary profession.
Okay.
And looking at that scene also made me realize that there are a lot of people who think they can write and who need a little bit of help to get their writing to publishable levels.
Okay.
And that's where editing comes in, is right. You can work with people to help them. I didn't start off in editing. I started off as a writing consultant,
Okay.
which is a completely different approach, but it's also centered on like helping people improve their
Could you
writing.
could you explain what a writing consultant does, if I can ask that?
Sure. Yeah, of course. So I became a writing consultant in an academic setting as a student.
Okay.
So what we do is we work with writers um, on specific like class assignments that they have, and we work with them to improve the paper that they're writing for their class. But it's a little bit more than that.
Okay.
What the editor's approach is, you've got an assignment, a text in front of you, and you have to make it the best that it could be. For a
Mm-hmm.
writing consultant, we have got a writer in front of us, and we have to make them the best writer that they can be.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
when and there's a difference there, right? So when we're giving them feedback on their paper, we're
Mm.
also explaining to them what the rules are,
Mm.
why we're giving that feedback, and
Yeah.
how they can replicate that skill in their
Okay.
own writing when we are not in front of them.
And then from there, you decided that you wanted to get into editing, or how did you decide that, okay, being a writing consultant is cool, but I want to get into being an actual editor now?
Yeah, that happened almost accidentally.
Okay.
I went to a writers conference, and as a writer, I was going there as a writer, and
Okay.
I happened to meet my advisor from college at this conference. and his like best friend, who is also the co-founder with him of this small press called Etruscan Press
Okay.
in the States.
Hmm.
And they, I guess, liked me at this conference because they offered me an internship with the press.
Wow.
And I entered this and I entered this internship, kind of hoping that it'll be a fun time for me to learn how the publishing process works from the inside, because that's
Right.
helpful as a
Mm.
writer.
Yeah.
Um, and then they handed me a book.
Oh, okay.
Now, the saying that we had within Etruscan about this book is that the story of its publication is longer than the novel itself.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it had kind of been in publishing hell for a very long time. It was in purgatory. It was never getting through.
Okay.
And they kind of made me the person responsible for making it work. So I was putting in copy edits, but I was also talking to our managing editor to make sure that everything was okay. I was somewhat in conversation with the book designer to make sure that they had what they needed. And they would sometimes come back with saying that, oh, these are edits I'm not going to make. You need to make those. So I would go ahead and do that. So I was talking to people across the board,
Huh?
trying to get everybody on the same page to get this book out there, to the extent and at the same time I was introducing this concept of editing on Google Docs to this publication house.
Okay.
Because up until then, what they were doing was each editor would get a copy of the novel. They would each make their own edits, send it back to the managing editor, and then it would be the managing editor's job to combine all of these different edits
Oh,
into the final manuscript.
that
It's a lot of
sounds,
work.
yeah, that sounds tedious.
Yeah. So I introduced them to this like collaborative editing process on Google Docs where everybody could edit the same document at the same time and see each other's edits, so
Mm-hmm.
that they could like edit accordingly. To me,
Yeah.
that made sense. There were a lot of issues along the way. Basically, I'd done collaborative editing in Google Docs, but never with a 300-page document.
Wow.
And Google Docs doesn't take 300 pages well. Especially when you've got 6 7 people editing it at the same time. That's a lot of data if you think about it.
Yeah, for sure.
But the process, I loved it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
um and I decided that I wanted to be an editor at that, because of that internship.
Okay, that's amazing that but I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Sometimes you only really realize what you love doing when you actually do it. And then you're like, oh my God, I actually really love this job, or this what I'm doing, and I could do this for the rest of my life, which I think is incredible that you found it through this. Because yeah, I guess for any other person who's not familiar and who's, I guess, not a fan of sitting and editing, they would have found it very tedious. But the fact that you found it enjoyable and you're like, oh my God, this is something I could do is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I would say being an editor was the best thing I did for my writing as well. It just kind of helps you understand from a reader's perspective in this very intense way, what you need to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just got lucky. I got lucky that I had a mentor who saw me at a writers conference. I was the youngest person there by over a decade.
Oh, wow.
uh and yeah, so the fact that somebody decided to pay attention to this kid who was
Uh-huh.
just hanging around, and decided to give me an opportunity, I just got lucky there, to be
Well,
honest.
no, but I mean, of course, you definitely even, of course, it's great. It's important that you get the right opportunities, which you did, but you've also worked for them, which I think is incredible. And you've definitely put in the work, which is just inspiring to see. But now that you are a writer and you're an editor as well, what are qualities according to you that make a writer good and an editor good?
That's a hard question to answer. um because that's differs based on the writer and based on the editor, right? I wouldn't say there's one quality that every writer needs to have or every editor needs to have.
Mm-hmm.
um if there is something that I will say that will help you a long way to survive, it's stubbornness. you can be a good writer and you can be a good editor. But if you want to do this professionally,
Mm-hmm.
if this is something that you want to focus on as part of your as a big part of your life and not as just a hobby,
Uh-huh.
the environment to doing it, the market is not very good right now, to be
Mm.
perfectly honest with you.
Right.
And being incredibly stubborn
Mm.
is the only thing that'll help you survive in this market.
Mm.
That's
Fair
just a
enough.
necessity.
Yeah.
If you want to be a good writer and you don't necessarily worry about that being a professional element,
Mm.
that quality is not necessarily, important. I'm thinking of it as a professional.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, for any writer, it's a cliche to say, and I hate this cliche that every writer needs to be a reader. It's not just a cliche, it's incomplete as
Mm.
advice.
Mm.
I think every writer needs to be receptive to the world around them from a
Mm.
critical eye. And that,
Right.
yes, involves reading quite a bit, but that involves just being open to things
True.
in your life.
Mm.
I have written the best poetry, one of my best poems, just going to a zoo and overhearing people
Mm.
just talking, right? And that has
Mm.
nothing to do with reading.
Mm.
That has to do with just being receptive to the world around you.
Yeah.
That's more important than anything else.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That's, I think, a conversation I've had with a few guests on this show previously as well. On if, people think it's important to be a reader, to be a writer, but I agree with you. Reading is an important part of it, but it's not the end all and be all of it. Um, Completely agree with that. But then, okay, let's talk about another myth, which is writer's block, right? Because
Ah,
like just that I feel like that expressions and everything. But no, let's talk about it because everyone has such different takes about writer's block. What is your take on it? And what is your take on creative burnout as well? Because sometimes I feel like there can be a thin line between writer's block and creative burnout. What is your take on both these things?
my take is writer's block does not exist.
Okay, fair enough.
Um, and let me kind of clarify that to the extent writer's block has been documented for years,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are a lot of writers who have talked about experiencing this block in their creative process. And that experience definitely exists. That's not what I'm saying, that the experience doesn't exist.
Uh-huh.
But writing at the end of the day is a form of art, right? It's a form of expression.
Right.
Think about others forms of expressions, right? Have you ever heard a guitarist say, I have musician's block, or a ballet dancer say, I have mover's block? I think there are other terms that are more helpful to think about that, whether you want to call it resistance. I think of it as part of the writing process.
Okay.
It's just that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So there's research showing that you can focus, like intense focus on deep work, up
Huh?
to about 4 hours a day.
Okay.
That's the maximum limit that anybody can focus.
Mm.
And that's with people who have a lot of experience focusing in their everyday lives. Focus is like a muscle. You kind of
Yeah.
have to exercise it. So if your
Right.
muscle is in a peak condition,
Mm.
then you can focus for 4 hours. For
Right.
a newbie, that might just be 1 hour.
Right.
So if you're doing good, intense writing where you enter that kind of flow state where the world ceases to exist and it's just you and the paper or the keyboard, whatever you're using,
Uh-huh.
that state is not sustainable for a very long time.
Mm.
So it's actually productive that when you've exhausted your focus muscle,
Right.
to walk away from the writing, to do something peripheral
Right.
that then supports your writing process
Mm.
in other ways.
Okay.
So that might just be, for me, that's just, I have a Rubik's Cube.
Okay.
So when I'm done writing, I'm just solving a Rubik's Cube. So I'm not
Mm.
thinking about writing, but it's going on in the background. So it's cooking in the background. And that's better way to process a lot of your thoughts is to do it subconsciously.
Okay.
So build your focus muscle.
Hmm.
Write intensely to the point where your focus muscle doesn't get exhausted, and then take a break. And that break is actually more productive than forcing yourself to sit in front of the screen and keep typing just for the sake of keeping typing. Because at that point, you're just typing, you're not writing.
Yeah, true.
So I think being in tune with our writing process, being in tune with our bodies, with our minds, we can get ourselves to write in a way that's optimal for us.
Yeah.
When you're out of tune,
Mm-hmm.
that's when you have that experience of feeling writer's block, but it's actually other things.
Yeah. No, I love that take, of it actually comes down to understanding yourself and what works for you, and then building the discipline and routine around that, which I agree with. It's true. One of the other things I did want to talk to you about is I know some of the things you're interested in are, translations, colonialism, languages. And I know you did this project, which was, I think, colonialism and power dynamics in literary translation praxis, which I found very fascinating. Could you tell us about that project? But also, can you talk to us a little bit about, colonialism and literature? Because that's a very interesting relationship, especially considering that, I guess, in a way, a lot of countries, I think the reason English is where it is today is because of possibly colonialism, but you would know better. So hence I will let you, talk about this.
Here's the thing. English is in its place as a global kind of lingua franca because of British colonialism. And all of these languages that are common across the world that are used for, say, world trade or cultural exchange or at the UN are almost all of them colonial languages, whether that's English, that's being the more prominent one, but like French, Dutch, these are all colonial languages. The Portuguese had quite a, huge colonies. And that's not just in the past. Let's acknowledge the fact that Taiwan is in a colonial situation. Puerto Rico is colonized. So there are still regions of the world that are colonized. So let's just acknowledge that colonialism isn't a thing of the past.
Right.
And the way that informs our literature and the way that it informs our schooling is important. So I'll talk from the Indian context.
Yeah.
Just because that's what I can speak to the most. I can speak a little bit to the US, and I will. But think about it. You and I were, I'm assuming, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing you were educated in an English medium school.
Yes, I was.
Right. And that's something that basically every Desi parent wants for their child.
Right.
Because if you want your child to succeed, you want to be in an English medium school so that they can get a big paying job. And there's definitely truth to that. Think about the violence involved in studying Indian history of colonialism in English, right? That's kind of impossible to do. To study the true horror of colonialism in English, it's just not possible. So I think M. Bessie Phillips, she's a writer from Trinidad and Tobago. She's a Tobagan writer.
Okay.
And she talks about how the trauma that comes into an Indian's heart when we say the word kala pani.
Yes, yeah.
How do you see that? Right?
Yeah.
So kala pani is a word that we hear. There's trauma and there's horror attached to it.
Yeah.
Can you express that horror in English?
Yeah, you really can't. That's true.
It's impossible, right? English is incapable of articulating its own violence upon all these countries of the world. And to think that has become our primary language, the fact that most of the literature we consume is in English, the fact that you and I are having this conversation is English, is kind of bonkers.
True.
So there's that element of it. Is the language itself is embedded with so much colonial violence that you cannot really think about anything out of those. You can't really think about colonialism in English and have a meaningful conversation.
True.
I would argue the same for race. Like, English is inherently a racist language.
Okay.
Think about black money or black sheep
I
as
see.
expressions,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Or light is good, dark is bad.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Oh,
Right?
wow. Yeah.
The same thing happens in Indian languages as well. So anything that's big is masculine, anything that's a smaller version of the big thing is feminine, at least in Hindi. Right?
Yeah.
Patila is a big one, patili is a small one.
Right. Yeah.
Every river in India has a female name. Every
Right.
ocean has a masculine name.
Yeah. It's true.
Except the biggest river in India, which is the Brahmaputra, which has a masculine name.
True.
Right?
True. Yeah.
The point is, the biases of the society, in whichever society you live in, are embedded into the language itself. Hindi is not, it is a colonial language, but in a very different way than English is, right? On a global scale, English
Right.
is a colonial language. And in that sense, English has the violence of colonialism embedded into it. So how do you talk about, say, the partition in English?
Which is, and we all
Is a
technically
question.
studied it also in English, which is what's crazy.
Yeah. It's kind of ridiculous. Like, if you read, say, Fatima Asgar's poetry about the partition, that's in English, and you read Gulzar's poetry in Urdu and Punjabi and Hindi about the partition, there's a difference in the way that they're able to articulate those violences, just based purely on the language. And of course, it's not really fair to compare people to Gulzar, but just making a point here.
Yeah.
Or like, take Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, read that in Punjabi, read that in English, you'll see a difference
Of course.
in the way that it articulates that violence.
Of course.
It's not able to capture the trauma of the partition. English just can't do it.
Right.
And so that's what I was thinking about with colonialism and language. And then that brought me to translation. Okay, you've got all of these traumas that you want to articulate. The problem is, let's pick up the partition, right? Our grandparents who experienced partition live, like both sets of my grandparents came over from what is now Pakistan to India.
Wow. Okay.
They experienced it, right? That's their lived experience, and they're not always able to talk about it.
Right.
And that's fair, right? That's understandable.
Their
grandkids, our primary language is English. We don't speak Punjabi the way that they do. We don't even speak Hindi the way that they do. Right?
Yeah.
So we are losing our connection to that partition, and we only know that partition through English.
Correct. Yeah.
That's kind of ridiculous. So you've inherited a violence you cannot articulate.
Yeah. True.
So what does it mean to take a text about the partition in those indigenous languages and translate it to English? And the question that I was asking with that research really was, can you make that translation without losing a lot of that inherent trauma? Is it possible to bend English into articulating that violence? And I don't have an answer for that. And that's kind of what I was studying. So the British Center for Literary Translation holds a translation workshop every summer.
Yeah.
An international translation workshop. So I applied for that, and by some miracle got in. So I ended up going there to kind of talk to writers and talk to translators and ask them, hey, let's talk about colonialism and translation, how you approach translation, keeping colonialism in mind when you're doing it, or do you keep colonialism in mind, is also like a question that I had. And I
Okay.
wanted to ask them. And so what I ended up doing was I interviewed a bunch of translators about their practice,
Uh-huh.
about the way that they go about choosing the text they translate, the process of translating, the process of getting it published, all the consideration that goes into that, including questions of power dynamics and colonialism. So that was that research.
Yeah.
That was a very long answer. I apologize.
No, it was very interesting to hear. And honestly, a lot of the things you said, because, it's all like right in front of us, but we don't really notice it. That's why when you were talking about it, it was like hitting me. I was like, oh my God, what you're saying makes so much sense. It's just that none of us really think about it. And it's great that you are talking about it, and you're kind of going into it and sort of putting it out there also in the world in a way, because it is important to, I think, be aware for sure, just given what all our history, like especially our ancestors history and stuff, and especially with, I think, the English language also. um, but talking about translation, and this was something because you mentioned Gulzar, and I was just thinking because so I had gotten this book of poems about 2 years ago, where basically it's a collection of poetry from different writers across India in different languages. So there's Hindi, Punjabi, Malayalam, um, there's Tamil, there's Bengali, like different languages. And basically, what Gulzar's done is he's translated all the poems into Hindi and in English. And you're right, because when I read like both versions of one poem, I could see the differences. And at the same time, because so I can't read or write Malayalam, but I can obviously understand Malayalam. And there was obviously a few in South Indian languages which he had, translated to Hindi and English. And I was just wondering how the Tamil version of this would sound like, or how the Malayalam version of a piece would sound like, because that would also be really nuanced and different in a way. So having said that, do you think translation is like helpful in terms of then getting all these pieces of literature out, or do you think translation is just kind of diluting work for writers in a way? Do you think it's it's possibly, no, it's a good thing because we're still getting the work out effectively, or do you think that no, it's you're completely diluting what the writer wants to say?
I think translation can be done well and can be done badly.
Okay.
Um, and the problem with translation publishing in the world in general, but I think that's true for a lot of Indian publishers as well, is the person who's deciding whether or not this should be published or whether or not this is good enough or who's editing it doesn't always know the original language.
Mm,
So what they end up doing is they look at the finished translation and they read it like a reader.
I
And
see.
the argument for that, of course, is that everybody who reads this book, who purchases this book, is not going to know the original language either. So
Mm,
because we are marketing towards people who don't know the original language, that's who translations are marketed towards, in
mm.
general.
Right.
um the publisher or the editor does not always need to know the original language while they're doing it either. So the
Mm,
focus is on putting out a piece that makes sense in the translation.
mm.
And there's this foreignization versus domesticization debate within translation quite a bit. The argument is when you're translating something from a different culture, and
Mm,
the farther the culture is from your own, the
mm.
target and the source culture are from each other, the more true this is. Some things are just going to sound weird.
All right. Okay.
Some things are just going to feel weird, right? That's just true for anything. And certain things are going to change meanings because of cultural associations
Mm,
attached to those things.
mm,
So, do you make it weird in the target language and then just let the reader deal with the weirdness because it's truer to the source? Or do you change things to
mm.
make it easier for the reader in the target language, but then you're going further and further away from the source, and it's kind of a fidelity issue that you're getting into?
Yeah.
And different translators fall at different places on that continuum. The point is that the publishers who are only looking at the translated version are always going to look for the comfort of the target reader, which is going to move the text further and further away from the source text. As a translator, I'm always for staying as close to the source as possible.
Right, fair enough.
As much makes sense, because even though the reader is not necessarily going to get the cultural reference always, or they might have different associations with the thing, I think the reader should be aware of the fact that they're reading a translation.
Right.
And the fact that they are reading, well, because a lot of translations are put out in such a way that readers don't always know that the book they're looking at is a translation. Right. So if you go to a book, the translator's name is really small if it's there on the cover at all, for instance. They're marketed as just another book. They're not marketed as, oh, this is this huge translation. There are very few exceptions to that.
Right.
So I think Emily Wilson's translations, because she translates the Odyssey, she translates Homer, so you can't really sell that as an original.
Yeah.
But what that does, that erasure of the translator does, or that diminution of the translator does, is it helps the reader feel that they're reading something that's closer to what the author intended, because there's no translator in the middle, right? I'm just reading what the author intended, and that's not necessarily true. There's always going to be translation choices that are being made,
right?
And we should be crediting translators as creators of a translated text. And acknowledging that the more the translator becomes visible within the reader's perception, the closer you can afford being to the source text, because the more the reader is aware that translation choices are being made, so they will read accordingly.
That's fair. That's a fair point.
So yeah, the example that I love to use is there's a scene in a book that I can't remember the name of, where there's a group of people who are sitting and having a conversation, and because this is a desi setting, the women aren't necessarily allowed to talk within the conversation. So this female character, who's badass, takes a bite out of an apple, and apples are crunchy.
Right.
So you can hear an apple in conversations. So by biting an apple, she's inserting her own voice into this conversation. And that's kind of the message behind this kind of tiny little detail. So the crunches of her biting this apple come at key moments within the dialogue. And you can kind of hear her voice within the context. So that's kind of the scene.
Okay.
And within an Indian context, an apple is just a crunchy fruit that you can hear when someone is chewing it. It's not much more than that.
Right.
Within a Western context, however, the apple gets associated with Eve.
Right.
There's this whole original sin situation going on. And because the scene already is kind of a resistance of the patriarchy, it adds layers and layers of meaning to the text.
Right.
So a translator has two options. They can just translate apple as apple and, be okay with the reader having these associations that are not there in the original text.
I see.
Or the translator can maybe translate it to a pear, where the point is still there, right? That is crunchy, but you don't have Adam and Eve suddenly coming into your story trying to get I like to trust my readers. I'm like, they know that this is based in an Indian context. They know this is not by a Christian writer and not aimed at Christian readers. So even if they are Christian, or if they're familiar with the Christian kind of mythology, they're not going to read Christianity into this text.
No, that's very fascinating to know, because, I think translations are, now sort of gaining some amount of popularity, because people are, I think, slowly starting to look at, other language writers. But it's interesting to know, right, the take that, just getting the cultural context of something is not always the easiest. So it's very fascinating to have this conversation and, hear your take on it. Moving to a slightly lighter zone, in poetry itself. So I know you've studied, like you've really like studied hardcore literature. You write poetry. You're very aware and educated about it. What is your take on social media poetry? This sudden, I don't want to say onslaught, but this sudden growing community of Instagram poets and poets on Twitter and, other places. Like, what is, do you think it's in a way it's good because it's made poetry accessible, or do you think people just have no clue what they're writing and they're just consuming whatever they want?
Firstly, I would say that I'm not as knowledgeable as you make me out to be. I have a very specific area of interest that I know a little bit about, and that's about it. But because you asked me the question, I've been thinking about it. And firstly, I would argue that in Insta poetry or social media poetry in general is not what's made poetry accessible. Poetry has always been accessible. Even think about, let's look at the Indian context again, right? We've talked about Gulzar ji as a poet. We've talked about it as a translator. He's also a songwriter. He's written so many Bollywood songs, and those are all poems too.
True.
I don't think you could find a person, or at least a Desi person, who will tell you that Bollywood songs are not accessible.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's about as accessible as it gets.
Yeah.
So poetry always has been accessible. It might not always have been accessible in the form that we think of as like this mushairas or the book of poems. Because Insta poetry has made poetry famous within a certain group of younger folks, right? And there's definitely value in that, and I don't want to take anything away from people who find that they can express themselves through Instagram or through Twitter or through TikTok, whatever it might be. There's nothing wrong with people going on social media and writing poems.
Right.
I just don't think social media is designed for it.
Fair enough. Okay.
The thing with social media is it rewards the lowest common denominator. The more relatable you are, the more generic you are, the more likes you'll get, the more retweets you'll get.
Fair enough.
It rewards being vague, it rewards being generic. And that's why you see the kind of poetry that you do on, say, Instagram, or before that, Tumblr was really popular with this type of thing, right? This kind of spilled ink stuff, this really raw. There's no like strong images. The thing is, that's not where poetry's strengths lie. The thing that makes poetry so good is that you can be intensely specific and personal about yourself. And by being that specific, you can speak to a wide range of people, right? So if you think about one of the more famous books of 2020, Deaf Republic by Ilya Kaminsky, that became super famous all over the world. He is a deaf poet who immigrated to the US from, I think, Russia. But please correct me if I'm wrong there. But he is writing about a community, a made-up community somewhere in like Eastern Europe or like the Slavic region, who are invaded by a foreign force, and as a part of their rebellion against this foreign force, become deaf. Right? So deafness for them is a kind of rebellion that they create, and they create a sign language that they can use to communicate with each other. It's this whole thing, right? And he says something along the lines of, we don't lose sound, but something silence in us strength. Our hearing doesn't weaken, but something silent in us strengthens.
Right.
That's the logic of there. So deafness as a superpower, deafness as rebellion, deafness as community is something that's explored. That is intensely specific.
Right.
That is not something I can relate to, personally speaking.
Right, right.
right? I'm not deaf. I don't have a whole lot of community members who are deaf or hard of hearing. I have a few,
Uh-huh.
right? I can't sign, but I can kind of relate to this very intensely specific experience to him speaks to my experience of rebellion, right? It speaks to this community that people create in order to fight off against outside forces. It speaks to the fight against colonialism that we've been talking about so far.
Right, right.
So that's the beauty of poetry. That's the strength that poetry has.
Hmm.
And social media algorithms are just not um com- they don't work with that type of poetic expression, you know?
Yeah. No, fair enough. Yeah.
So
Right.
most social media poetry that we see is fighting against the algorithm,
Uh-huh.
or it is following the algorithm, but it's not taking advantage of what poetry can do as a form.
Hmm. Fair
So that's
enough.
kind of my take on like social media poetry. Again,
Hmm.
I have a lot of respect for folks who gain these huge followings,
Mm-hmm.
right? I have no right to criticize somebody who's writing and appealing to more people than I am, right?
Yeah. No,
That's
fair
just
enough.
true.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Uh
fair enough. No, because the reason I asked this is because I feel like it's such a, everyone has their own opinions about it, right? Because with me, at least what I think is, I'm okay with it. It's like you said, I mean, if people want to express themselves and if social media is giving you that outlet to express yourself and experiment and, do whatever, go for it. It's fine. That's completely fine. But, and I think it's like you said, everyone has their own preferences and choices by the end of the day on what they want to consume, what they don't want to consume, for sure. But yeah, I think just to kind of shift gears a little bit, since we've spoken so much about writing and whatnot, I want to talk a little bit about your personal life. So this is something like we've slightly touched upon before, but obviously it would be great if you could share your experience, which is about your journey of identifying as non-binary. um, because I can speak for myself when I say that I don't know many people who identify, on different scales of the spectrum in terms of, say as non-binary, or say even as pansexual or asexual, or other parts which I'm not even aware of, honestly, and I'm really trying to educate myself. And I think with the way the world is changing and evolving, people need to be obviously more aware and educated about it, and there just unfortunately isn't enough conversation happening, especially in a South Asian context. So I really want to ask, what has your journey been like, with identifying as non-binary? What are misconceptions around it? What are things you wish people knew, and stuff? So if you can, it would be great to hear your story.
just to clarify, I am bisexual and non-binary.
Okay.
So just to put that out there,
Yeah, please do. Please do.
the the thing with that is I think I've always kind of had a sense, um but I didn't really have the language to express what it was that I was feeling
Mm-hmm.
and that I was experiencing. So, and that comes back down to the biases of the language are in the biases of the culture are inherent within the language.
Uh-huh.
Think about it. If you're thinking about non-binary identity and Hindi, which was the primary spoken language in my house,
Hmm.
verbs are gendered in Hindi, right?
That's true.
There are no non-binary verbs in Hindi at all.
Hmm.
So that becomes something that you have to kind of learn to deal with,
Uh-huh.
and it becomes harder to figure out your identity when there's no language to express it in.
Hmm. Okay.
And I think that is why I felt drawn to English as a language, is as colonizing as it is. It's
Hmm.
where I found my identity, both in terms of sexuality and gender.
Right. Okay.
So that is kind of why I have such a fraught relationship with the English language. Is there are non-binary people even within the South Asian context. There always have been, right? but the language around them is imperfect, and not always respectful. And I've just found it over time, really, just kind of learning more and talking to people and reading a lot of texts.
Okay.
Is what it comes down to, is finding queer writers, finding theorists, gender
Hmm.
theorists. Judith Butler was like a huge influence.
Okay.
Um, if you want to talk about Indian authors, Ismat Chughtai,
Hmm.
it's kind of important within that conversation.
Right.
Devdutt Pattnaik
Right.
is another one.
Hmm.
Um, so those things are something that I would urge anybody to explore. We should also kind of acknowledge, since we've been talking about colonialism, is the imposition of the binary in South Asia is very much a colonial artifact. We've always had a space in Indian culture for people, for trans people, for non-binary people, for gender fluid people. Those places have not always been the most respectful, although some have been.
Uh-huh.
So we've always had that as part of our culture. But
Right.
then the British came in and kind of imposed a lot of, and now none of those spaces are respectful, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the work around queer rights in India is the work of decolonization.
Hmm. Okay. No, and thank you for sharing that because, like I said, I think these conversations are important and we need to have more of them. Um, but yeah, we're slowly coming towards the end of this interview. But
Already?
yes, I know, right? Even I can't believe we're coming to the end because I was having so much fun with this conversation. But all good things must come to an end, sadly, as they say. But yeah, so we usually end with these last two questions. So the first one is, um, what are your aspirations? What are you looking forward to in the near or even distant future?
Well, you already know this, and we'll have people find out. I'm hoping to do a PhD in English soon.
Hmm.
Um, I've said to you before that my father wanted me to be a doctor, as in go into medicine.
Yeah.
And we made a deal that I will become a doctor. It's just never going to be in medicine.
Okay.
So I'm hoping to do a PhD soon. So I'm applying for PhD programs. And if that comes along, that's the short term and the long term answer, is that I'll do a PhD and hopefully be teaching poetry
Oh,
soon.
wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think you'd make a brilliant teacher. I've had the good
Oh
fortune
no.
of, no, no, I really, I mean this. I've had the good fortune of attending some of the sessions because Saoirse and I happen to be in this writers group that Saoirse founded called Palimpsest. And the sessions are just incredible. I always come out of those meetings much, smarter and well informed. So, credit you for creating that space. And I can, really picture you teaching and doing such a fine job at it, honestly.
And if folks want to join Palimpsest, please, um, we are looking for writers. So I'm going to throw that out there, like
Yes, please
the
do.
self, the shameless person that I am.
No, no, please do.
Um, yeah, please reach out to me or Sangeeta for that matter, and we would be happy to tell you all about Palimpsest and have you join if you would like to.
Yeah. And if there are writers listening to this, please do. It's a great space. You'll meet such like a diverse group of people and you'll learn a lot. Honestly, you will. I can speak from personal experience. That's why I can vouch for it, honestly speaking. But yeah, now coming to the last question of the day. What is a piece of advice or learning you'd like to share with people? It can be creative, professional, or something you've just experienced in life and you wish more people were aware of and knew.
well, What's advice? I mean, I'm 24 years old. Am I old enough to be giving
or
advice
something you've
right
learned
now?
in life, or something you've learned in life, you've experienced, you've learned, and you're like, wow,
Uh,
I wish I knew this. I wish more people knew about this.
the only thing I don't know if it's a wow thing or if people need to know it, but it served me well, so I'll share it. Um, be intentional about whatever it is you're doing.
Mm,
Um, and that could be okay. What am I doing with my life? What do I do in a day? Is it serving my long-term goals?
right.
What additional things do I need to do to um, reach those goals that I have? Do I even have goals in the first place?
Yeah.
And also thinking about how you're doing things.
Right.
Are you doing it in the way that best serves you, your goals, your communities?
Mm,
Just I think being intentional is what it all comes down to, because that's at the end of the day going to decide what results you get.
mm,
Um, so that's one piece of advice. And the other thing that I would say is increase your surface area for serendipity. I think that
right.
is the best way that I can explain that.
But what do you mean by increase
Um,
the surface area for serendipity? What? I mean, I get what you're saying, but how would you, I guess, say it in a simpler form? Is what I'm saying.
yeah, that is the simplest form I can say. It's okay. So unexpected things will always happen to you in life, right?
That's true.
That's always going to happen, and unexpected can be good, it can be bad, it can be whatever, but unexpected is good in and of itself, even if it doesn't always lead to the most positive outcome. It's always a good thing for something that wasn't planned to happen.
Hmm. Hmm.
Outside of like accidents, don't get into situations where you get into an unexpected accident. That's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But if you have a choice, say between, and this is like not, this is COVID, so sit at home, but otherwise, between sitting at home and watching Netflix and going out to a party, go to that party. If you have a choice between going on a vacation alone versus going with the group, make sure you go on a vacation that's going to put you in touch with the most uh in the most unexpected situations, in touch with people you won't normally interact with.
Right.
um we get so caught up in our routines. We go to the same shops when we need to buy something. We go to work every day. We interact with the same like 30 people in our lives,
Uh-huh.
um that your chances of something unexpected happening are zero
Right.
or close.
Mm.
But if you put yourself in situations, if you go to like the Jaipur Literature Festival, for instance, or go to a different bookshop to buy your books,
Right.
you put yourself in situations of interacting with people you don't normally interact with,
Uh-huh.
and that's almost always going to lead to positive outcomes,
Hmm.
or
Right.
it's going to lead to a lesson of some sort.
Yeah.
Don't put yourself in like harm's way,
Right.
of course,
Mm-hmm.
but increase the chances of something unexpected happening.
Mm.
Because that's how you'll get those like things that you hadn't planned. I talked about being intentional.
Right.
Sometimes you need things that you hadn't planned or things that you hadn't thought of, because we're not capable of thinking of every possible thing
Right.
in the world.
Yeah.
I was being very intentional about being a writer when I got that publishing internship and agreed to do it.
Hmm.
Um, but editing came to me because I put myself in a situation where I was doing something I'd never done before with people I'd never worked with before.
Right.
So increase your surface area for serendipity.
Yeah. Okay. We got that. And on
Yeah.
that beautiful note, we have now come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for being here, Saoirse. It was lovely talking to you. I had so much fun. I really learned a lot. I feel like I always learn so much more after having a conversation with you. And I really think our listeners will too. So thank you so much for being on this show. I hope you had fun.
I did. I did. Thank you, Sangeeta, for inviting me, but also for asking all of these wonderful, complex questions, and really opening a space for conversation. That's always very important. And I love what you're doing with this podcast. So I'm very glad to be a part of it.
Thank
Tiny
you.
little part.
Oh, no, you're an important part. Thank you so much, Saoirse. So that was my conversation with Saoirse. I really learnt a lot from that chat, especially about translations and the English language. Closing this episode with 2 pieces of writing narrated by Saoirse. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next week with a new guest and a new chronicle to share. Talk soon!
Alright, I'm going to read 2 poems that I've written and then an excerpt from a short story from a writer's work which I edited. So here's the first poem. To my translator. Let us do what you call wondering and I call a search to know more. Let us descend down the steps of these lines. Dress in layers. The monsoons are unpredictable here. The alleyways often damp. Wear comfortable shoes. Unexpected, unseen silences take root in the cracks of the steps. You could trip and sprain an ankle. The stone stairs at the threshold of my home have dissolved in the darkness like the sugar in my cup of tea. Come, let us build a night on the marble edifice of silence, spread freshly laundered sheets over the freckled sky, and light the twin candles of our bodies. Even the dew cannot detect the whisper of our moans. I have searched for the stones for years. Now I wander in the depth of your tongue. Maybe if I emerge from you, I will find the entrance. This next poem is called Duplex, and it's written in the form duplex that was invented by Dr. Jerica Brown. I've never desired the embrace of a home. I don't want to settle down in a place. I don't want to settle for a home or a city or a man who will not miss me tomorrow. This man refuses to miss me tomorrow. His tender hand pulls me to a place he calls home. His calloused hand pulls me from a place I call home. The cracks of his palms grow in a vase meant for my roses. A vase meant for my joys cracks in his hands, cracks I overstep on my way home. Here's the way to the place I call home. Keep walking, stopping only for conversation among friends. The man I called a friend never calls me for conversation. I never desired the man. I just called him home. This coming piece is an excerpt from a short story called Search by Monisha Raman that was published in the Osava Literary Review. The winding roads take me to the settlements of the men and women whose bones gave these plantations its skeletal framework, around which the world's most famous brew was built. We drive by the row houses with asbestos roof and shabby walls. Within this vastness of tree shrubs, it was destined that Pati's life becomes entwined with Deva's. The estates had then changed hands from the colonial state to private holders, and there was some freedom that came with this change. I quickly scrolled through my phone to find the scanned page from Pati's journal. The story is titled The Girl Who Tripped on Her Skirt. I have memorized the following lines. She was a naive country girl who could not determine the apt height of her long skirt. She either folded it at her waist to expose the lower part of her calf muscles or tied it below her navel and had the skirt sweep after her. For this she was often mocked. Deva taught her to adjust the position of the skirt above her navel or on it, depending on the length of the attire. He taught her that the hem should rest on her ankle. He also taught her to move her digits swift enough for the game of 5 stones. He showed her how to balance on the trunk while climbing the silver oak tree. He made her laugh endlessly. He filled her life with the brightest colors of the evening sky, invigorating her vision, which was accustomed to the greens in her vicinity. This is what Patti read to me. But within the pages are concealed parts of the story that she did not narrate. He was the first to spot the blood stain on her skirt. He told her that she smelled and soothed her worry. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders and walked with her as she swept her way home. One day he taught her how to fold her half sari in 5 neat pleats. You see, 5 is for young girls and 4 is for older women. I've seen Akka do it. He smiled as he pinned the folded pleats of her sari to her blouse. He read to her excerpts from Das Kapital even as adolescents. Do you know what real liberty is? He would smile. The humble glint in his eyes knew that he belonged here at the lowermost rung of the ladder. However, there was a deep hunger within him to break free from the chains that the world order had tied around him. There is a beautiful land away from these hills. When we grow up, I will cross oceans and build castles by the lagoon for us. We will be free souls. Your hands will not be stained with the juice of tea leaves like your mother's. When we go to bed, we will not smell of tea. Would you like to come with me? This he said under the gracious shade of monkey paw tree as the air smelled of petrichor. I strongly encourage you to go and check out the entire story on the website of the Usawa Literary Review.